can arrive when they get here. Thank you. So good morning and afternoon to everyone wherever you are around the country. Welcome to our webinar today entitled Enabling Community Resilience to Fire and Flood. My name is Chris Manning from Water Sensitive Cities Australia, and I'll be your host for today. So first of all, I wanted to acknowledge the country. So I'd like to acknowledge the Bindal people of Thulgari Wajah, Townsville, south of the Ross River, on whose land I am on today. I also, on behalf of everyone in the audience, want to acknowledge the First Nations peoples and their lands from across Australia who have and continue to play a key role in water resource management and stewardship. I pay my respects on behalf of myself and the audience members to their elders past, present and emerging. So today we've got a webinar. Our webinar today is entitled Enabling Community Resilience to Fire and Floods. And we've got two researchers who are going to talk to the perspective of floods and flood governance, and one talking to perspective of fires from the Fire to Flourish program as well. So first of all, we'll have Ewan Hind, a doctoral research candidate, and he'll be talking about enabling resilience-oriented urban flood governance. And then we'll hear from Dr. Adriana Keating with her presentation around Thrive Governance in Action, Community-Led Disaster Resilience. They'll go for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll have enough time for about 10 to 15 minutes of questions and answers. So what I'd like you to do, if you don't mind, is put your questions in the Q&A function of this platform at any time during the session, and then we'll take questions at the end of the two presentations. So I'm going to introduce both Ewan and Adriana collectively now, and then they can follow on with their presentations. So Ewan is a PhD candidate at MSDI Water. His research focuses on the role of governance arrangements in achieving flood resilient outcomes. Ewan has extensive global experience in boundary spanning roles, helping industry connect with interdisciplinary research and translates emerging insights into policy and practice change. Dr. Adriana Keating is a system thinker whose research focuses on human dimensions of disasters at the science, policy and practice interface. With 15 years of experience in the field, she's an expert in disaster resilience, whose work utilises system analysis, measurement and decision support methodologies to conceptualise and affect change in disaster resilience, both in Australia and internationally. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass over to Ewan to give us his presentation.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to everyone who has taken the time out to join this webinar today. Looking forward to it. I see a couple of familiar names in the participant lists, which is nice as well. So my background before starting this PhD project, as Chris just alluded to in his introduction, has been in research adoption roles in and around the water sector. And some of the project work I did in those roles made me aware that we have a particular challenge in the urban flood management space. And that challenge is that our ambitions for flood resilience, which are increasingly being articulated in policy and strategy around the country, they don't fit particularly easily with existing decision-making arrangements and processes. And the research that I've delved into in the last year and a half since starting this project has really confirmed for me that this mismatch between ambition and governance is a key reason why we are finding it difficult to translate our ambitions for flood resilience into practice. So I'm hoping that my project can address this challenge by ultimately developing evidence-based guidance that will help floodplain managers, local government authorities, the private sector, and communities themselves to identify and prioritize the social and institutional conditions that they need to put in place to shift from our current governance arrangements to new ones that are better aligned to resilience thinking and concepts. The key question, therefore, for my doctoral research is what socio-institutional conditions enable resilience-orientated urban flood governance? Now, I can't do a presentation on ambiguous topics like governance and resilience without doing a little bit of spending a little bit of time on definitions. I've only got one page, and so I'll do it quickly. As anyone who's worked in this space knows, I could spend the entire webinar today just on defining resilience, but I'll save you all of that. And because Adriana and I both need to finish in the half hour, I'll push through the definitions for now. I'm more than happy to come back and talk further about them, though, in the question and answers and discussions. So my research is understanding flood resilience as the ability of a community to thrive alongside flood risk by using individual and collective capacities, not just to cope and adapt, but importantly to predict and transform in the face of uncertainty. Governance is being understood as the complex and broad processes in which public and private actors, through formal and informal mechanisms, come together to make decisions about collective challenges and services. And a governance system is all of those elements that go into performing the function of governance in that definition above. Okay, so with those definitions out of the road, let's get into the detail of my project. Quick bit of context. Why is this important? As many of you know, our current ways of trying to understand and manage urban flood risk aren't as effective as they need to be. Flood risk is increasing rather than decreasing. This graph here is charting the increase in both the number of events globally, but also in the total damage and cost these events are having. We felt this recently in Australia over the last few years, as we've had floods across much of southeastern Australia in particular. These are just a few headlines from newspapers over the last few years, really hammering home the growing size of this impact from flood risk. The scholarship on flood management and the recent inquiries into flood events that have taken place around the country have coalesced around a couple of themes in terms of the limitations of our conventional approaches to managing urban floods. These limitations are that our decision-making is fragmented and siloed, that there's often a lack of clarity on responsibilities. This is particularly the case when we start to shift into resilience thinking and long-term capacity building. We still often have quite top-down technocratic decision-making processes. And this can often lead to a lack of understanding of local context and local strengths. And very often our mitigation measures and solutions are reactive and have an overemphasis on structural measures. And we have decades of evidence to suggest that just taking structural approaches leads to the perverse outcome of raising risks. And our current approach often tends to compound systemic disadvantage as well. These are kind of the common themes around why we need to change. And you'll notice that all of these really are governance issues. These are collective decision-making issues. So governance is key. And the core problem is that our ambition for urban flood management has grown significantly, but our governance systems haven't matured alongside to support those ambitions. To really map this out, what I've done is taken a systems thinking approach to try to understand how flood management thinking and practice has changed over time. To do that, I've used this iceberg model. This may be familiar to many of you. It's a well-established and understood approach in the systems analysis field to understand why an event, which is that very top of the pyramid or the iceberg, why an event that we see unfolds in the way in which it does. The idea behind the model is that the event is really the only part that's visible. So in this case, it could be a flood event, or it could be decisions taken and mitigation measures put in place, like the release of updating and releasing of flood mapping, for example. So that's the event that people can see. But what led to that is the part that's difficult to understand, and like an iceberg is often hidden and ignored. This model suggests that really the fundamental part of this is our mental models, how we understand the world. This informs the structures for decision making that we put into place, and those structures then inform the patterns of behaviors that we take to address challenges. I took this model, addressed it to the scholarship on urban flood governance, and was able to identify the following characteristics for each of these stages, each of these parts of the iceberg, if you like. So for mental models, really what I'm looking at here are mindsets. So this is our shared understanding of how the world works, what the problem is. In the flood space in particular, what sort of concept of resilience we're bringing to the table. Also looking at knowledge, so the types of knowledge we bring to the table to address our challenges, and then the values around what's important and how we should work through things. In the structure level, there the key components I'm looking at are actors, both individual and collective, and the capacities or otherwise that they bring to the table, the mechanisms through which they interact and work together, whether they're closed or whether they're open, whether they're scaled, and then the norms, which is really the rules of the game. So how we decide who has power, how decisions should be made, etc. And at the very top for pattern, this is really focusing on that higher level of policy, strategy, flood management practice, and then the important issue around resources. So where we put money and time and how those decisions are made. So I took this model, looked at the literature on urban flood management and how it had changed over time, and was able to identify that core problem of significant increase in ambition without complementary increase in governance structures. To map this out, I've used a conceptual framework, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. For those of you who haven't seen this, this is from the CRC for water sensitive cities. This is the city-state continuum, and it is showing from left to right the typical progress of water service delivery in a city, going all the way from, first of all, worrying about simple water supply issues, further on moving into the drained area, which is about dealing with floods. And then at the very end, the right of the continuum is the future ideal type state, which is a water sensitive city. I've used this conceptual framework and adapted it for floods, made it a bit more colorful for the moment. And this is what I've been able to identify in the literature to date. These four governance approaches to managing urban flood risk. It starts on the very left here with a defend mindset, which is the oldest approach to managing urban floods, and very much comes from an engineering mindset of wanting to remove floodwaters from cities. The light blue that I've called integrate here begins to come into its own in the early 20th century and in the mid 20th century with the rise of urban planning and then environmental and ecological consciousness in the 60s and the 70s. And in the flood management space, this has seen us develop new approaches that bring together urban form and nature-based solutions to deal with flood risk. The third one is managing risk. So this developed out of the 70s and 80s and the neoliberal turn to risk management around the world. And this is really putting a risk lens over our flood management and also opening up the number of people in decision making, in particular individuals and the private sector in the form of insurance companies. Those first three, I would say, are the approaches that are you can currently see in play to varying degrees across the country. This orange one, which I've named Thrive, is really the proposed future state which I've identified. So when we go back to my definition of flood resilience before, this is about the idea of communities being central to the process and looking at resilience capacities of coping, adapting, and transforming to change. So I've identified under that iceberg model before, I've identified the differences between each of these. We don't have time to go through all of them, but I'll just quickly show you what I've found for the defend mindset and then for the thrive one to do a quick comparison and bring the message home. So here's what I found for the defense, the oldest of the flood management approaches. The mindset here really is about making our urban areas flood-free, thinking that floodwaters don't have any role to play in a desired urban environment. The resilience concepts that it brings to the table are very much an engineering resilience approach, and it's emphasizing capacities of resistance and coping. So thinking of resilience as a system being able to absorb change, but then bounce back to the status quo. Stationarity is important, and really it understands the world as a complicated problem. The values tended to have been that it was very much a state-led solution, looking for public good outcomes, and it valued physical capital in the form of infrastructure particularly. Very much a top-down decision-making process based on authority and standards. And the governance mechanisms that suited it tend to be very much this hierarchical closed system of state actors then developing standards and pushing that down to the market and to the civil society, which is that little diagram to the right. If we then compare that to the thrive, so the ultimate end of my continuum, you'll see here that there's really quite a significant change in these characteristics. The mindset here becomes that flood, it's impossible to engineer flood away, that flood, if we build near rivers, if we build near the ocean, then floods will be a part of our urban life. So it begins to become a mindset of thriving alongside flood risk. And it brings to the table not just capacities of coping and adapting, but as I mentioned before, critically being able to transform a system. So understanding that change is inherent in systems and it's not always problematic. It also offers up the opportunity for change. Very much a complex problem approach. The value here is really about placing community in the center of decision-making, looking for community outcomes and enabling self-organization. Looking at physical, natural, economic, social, human, and institutional capital, and bringing in a transdisciplinary knowledge domains. Community-centered, suddenly power is understood through legitimacy and trust rather than top-down authority. And the mechanisms start to get far more complex. You have polycentric decision-making mechanisms that are networked, that are open, that are scaled. And I've tried to represent that here on the right in terms of a governance mode as this open system here, the dashed line, and putting C, which is civil society, community, kind of really up at the top, but interacting and partnering with the other areas. So the way in which I am trying to address my project is I am looking for, and I've identified case studies across the country that I think neatly reflect the different types of approaches in that continuum I showed before. For the defend mindset, I am hoping to start working in Lismore. Again, running out of time, so I can go into why I've made these decisions perhaps at the end of the presentation. For that integrated approach where we're bringing together urban planning and nature-based solutions, I'm looking at Fisherman's Bend in Melbourne. And then for the risk management, I will be looking at Brisbane, given that I think Queensland is probably the most advanced in terms of risk-based planning approaches to flooding in the country. It's qualitative analysis. I'm doing semi-structured interviews and focus groups with practitioners and community members. And these are the participant groups I'm looking at engaging with. And I will say, if you represent any of those groups there and you are interested in getting involved in this research project, it'd be great to get in touch and have discussions, because I'd very much appreciate to get as many perspectives involved in this as I can. I will also say that if it is of interest to people on the webinar, I'd be more than happy to come back in a year or at a later date to present some of the findings from this research now that I've just started fieldwork. All right, thank you all. I'll stop there and then hand over to Adriana.
Thanks very much, Ewan. That was fantastic to see. And anyone who is keen to get involved with Ewan's research, I would really encourage you to do so. I think it's really great stuff. And it's really important that we sort of understand how to move towards this Thrive or resilience-based governance model. Now, I want to, first of all, apologise because as you can hear, I'm actually quite croaky. I do have a cold, so please bear with me, and I will try and not croak at you for too long. As Chris mentioned, I'm Dr. Adriana Keating. I'm a research fellow with the Fire to Flourish program at Monash University. And I was really excited when the Worcester team suggested this webinar topic, because I think it's something that's been churning around over in my head for nearly 15 years now. I started my research in the disaster space when I was an economist, please don't hold it against me, looking at the cost of bushfires. And currently, and then sort of doing some projections to what they might cost under climate change. And I must say, at that time, we weren't being conservative, but we had no idea at how fast things would progress. I mean, the progression of the climate change impacts has been far worse and more devastating than we were projecting 15, 20 years ago. Anyway, I was trying to also estimate the value of investing in bushfire risk reduction. And then I moved to the flood space by joining the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance, which at the time was working with several hundred communities across the world, mostly rural communities in developing countries, supporting them to strengthen their flood resilience. And during that time, I was constantly struck by what I was learning about community flood resilience in, say, rural Nepal, applied to bushfire resilience in peri-urban Australia. It was really interesting. And then I came back to the bushfire space by joining Monash and the Fire to Flourish program. And again, I'm seeing all this potential for cross-fertilised learning between bushfire and flood. And so today I just want to share some of that thinking in the context of Fire to Flourish, which I see as a program that's endeavouring to enact that thrive-oriented governance system that Ewan was just talking about. Okay, there we go. So over the last decade or so, particularly since Black Saturday in 2009, and then, of course, even more so since the mega fires in 2019, 2020, there's been this increasing recognition, at least from fire-affected communities, that we need to implement some huge changes, some transformational changes in the way in which we approach bushfires. We're hearing loud and clear from communities that the current system isn't working for them, and that they need more agency, they need more power to determine their own futures. So Fire to Flourish came out of this call, and our mission is to trial innovations in community led resilience, to figure out if and how it can be done, and then to influence those transformational changes at a larger scale to embed that system across the country. So we're intensively working with 4 LGAs that were devastated by the 2019-2020 fires. They are East Gippsland, Eurobodalla, Tenterfield, and Clarence Valley. When we say we want to enable systems transformation, that we want to move towards community-led resilience strengthening, what exactly does that look like? So Ewan introduced the iceberg model, and I think it's a really good one for digging into this. So we've run a number of workshops with disaster-affected community members to understand exactly what they're experiencing now, the current system, and what they would like the future system to look like instead. That's the community-led resilience-based system, or thriving. So currently, we've got a situation where, in the bushfire space at least, but I think a lot of this applies in the flood space too, we're seeing increasing disaster risk, communities excluded from decision-making, we're seeing burnout, mistrust, anger. The structures that are driving this are top-down reliance-based governance systems, fragile and centralised critical infrastructure systems, rigid funding mechanisms. That's just to name a few of the structures. The mindsets underlying the current system, regardless of, I think, the pretty words that we see in a lot of policy documents, what's underlying the current system is this mindset that communities are passive, they're untrustworthy, they're helpless, and they just need to shut up and do what they're told. We're seeing tensions everywhere between community groups, between communities and agencies, issues with valorisation of volunteers. We're seeing local knowledge not being truly valued. On the other hand, a community-led or a thrive-based governance system could look very different to this. So ideally, we would like to see sustainable development increasing and disaster risk reducing simultaneously, even in the face of climate change. We'd like to see communities in the emergency management sector working together with mutual respect. Communities would be active, engaged, and empowered. Structurally, we would see local, horizontal, collaborative governance systems, so-called community-based governance, where caring for countries centred, where there's decentralisation of essential services, redundancy in the provision of essential lifelines, and then sort of in the funding space, flexible, accessible funding for community priorities. And the mental models underlying this system see communities as active, adaptive, reliable, and trustworthy. And critically, communities see themselves like that as well, which is not necessarily the case just yet. We want to see mutual respect across the board and the idea that communities are in charge from the bottom up as the default. Now, I do a lot of engagement with institutional players in the emergency management and disaster resilience space, and there is a huge amount of people, perhaps some of you are on the call today, who have this mindset. So we've got issues with our structure and what we're seeing, but a lot of the mindsets have already started to shift. So it's just a case of people working in a system that has not caught up with that shift in the mindset as well. I'm not saying that the current mindset is not still dominant, but we're seeing a lot of people right across the board who've got this shift in mindset. And this kind of shift is obviously occurs at multiple different levels, from the individual level right up to the national level. But we're trying to push the envelope a little bit at the community and the LGA level in Fire to Flourish to demonstrate how it's done. So we're guided by a number of principles. I'm getting conscious of time already, so I'm not going to read them out for you. But these principles about sort of how we are embedding this community-led resilience mindset in our own minds and in the structures of our program, because we exist within the system as well, of course. So we need to constantly revisit our principles so that we can make sure that we're embedding this mindset and that our program is living its own ideals. The substantial change that we need to do needs to begin from within us. So what we're doing is we're trialling a number of resilience planning to granting processes. At the community level, Fire to Flourish has local teams in every LGA. And these local teams, supported by the resilience researchers at Monash, take communities through various resilience planning processes. Now, these can look quite different in different places, but ultimately it's about envisioning a transformed local system and identifying the immediate needs and the long-term leverage points for making that vision a reality. So we're just there to facilitate this process. We trust the community to determine for themselves what this looks like. We don't tell them what the best thing for them to do is. They figure that out themselves. We just take them through a process. And as part of that process, we always ensure to look at strengthening community disaster resilience holistically. And by that, I mean, we're looking across multiple domains of resilience. So the built environment, of course, the natural environment, economic well-being, health and well-being of people, and of course the social capital aspect, which is the glue that holds it all together. Once the community has determined their own resilience priorities, we put our money where our mouth is and we give them grant funding to pursue those priorities. So traditionally, grant processes typically have funder develop specific eligibility criteria that don't usually meet or address the community's priorities or needs, or allow for quick access to funds when they're needed the most. So participatory granting, on the other hand, is an approach that shifts the power to communities so that people affected by the decisions are the ones who are making the decisions. Those traditional rigid eligibility criteria and strict acquittal processes, they're there on the assumption that they're the most effective way to control funding allocation and to avoid fraud. How can you just give people money and trust them to do what they say they're going to do with it? It's a fair point. It's a big question. But what our participatory granting trials show is that accountability to one's own community is more effective in terms of risk mitigation strategy. And we're showing that it's working. So the evidence and the insights that we're gathering are instrumental for influencing this much needed systems change in how funding is allocated to communities before, during, and after events. Transitions in policy and practice. So this is the heart of what Fire to Flourish is doing. We're researching, experimenting, and trialling these new approaches, and they are in many ways quite radical, to demonstrate that they can work, that they can be legitimate, they can have fidelity, and to provide the evidence and the guidance on embedding them at scale. So some of you might be familiar with this S model of transitions, but I won't spend too much more time on it. I want to now change track a little bit and talk about measuring or assessing disaster resilience and some of the research I've been doing over the last decade in that challenge in relation to both flood and bushfire resilience. So earlier I mentioned the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance, which back in 2013 began the development of the Flood Resilience Measurement for Communities tool. Now, over the last decade, that resilience measurement framework was applied in nearly 400 communities across the world, which makes it the most extensively applied standardized resilience measurement framework in the world. And while I was involved with that work, I was constantly struck by how many of the indicators that we call sources of resilience, but indicators that we had in this measurement framework apply for bushfires as well. So as time went on and the framework was used, it became evident that, luckily, I wasn't the only one having this thought. So the Alliance moved to expand into the climate resilience measurement for communities, which is a multi-hazard disaster resilience measurement framework. Initially, it was flood. You could measure for flood resilience and or heat wave resilience. Enter Fire to Flourish, and we needed a way to assess resilience in our programs, so we partnered with the Zurich Alliance to build the bushfire layer. It's called the wildfire layer in the tool, of course, because the tool is global, but we call it bushfires here in Australia. And they're now developing the storm layer as well, so it's expanding out. And what's interesting, I think, about this framework for this topic is the way that it conceptualizes community disaster resilience. So we have this set of general or generic indicators, and these are effectively hazard blind. So they're really important for disaster resilience, regardless of what particular hazard the community faces, whether that be one that they've faced before, one they've never faced before, one that we've never thought of. And these make up a significant proportion of the framework. And so building up these features or characteristics of a community benefit you regardless of the hazard that you're talking about. We then have a set of what we call hazard-specific indicators that measure the same concept, but separately for each hazard. So a good example here might be the early warning system. So you basically always need one regardless of your hazard, but you need to assess it for each hazard, because you might have a really great early warning system for flood, but a hopeless one for bushfire, or vice versa. And finally, we have a handful of indicators that are pretty unique to that hazard. So for flood, we might have the functionality of physical protection. For bushfire, we might have the effectiveness of a fuel hazard management program, that kind of thing. So that's the way we're sort of understanding this complex space of community resilience to multiple hazards. We use this framework to measure community resilience to both bushfire and flood in five fire to flourish communities in East Gippsland and Clarence Valley. We conducted nearly 200 household surveys, over 30 key informant interviews, ran 10 focus groups to collect the data to do this assessment. So this standardized resilience measurement assessment. And here's just a little snapshot of the high-level findings. The assessment that you're seeing here is broken down by domain. So we're looking across human, social, physical, financial, and natural capitals. What we can see is that the capital-based scores generally track in the same direction for generic and bushfire and flood resilience groups, but that there are some differences. And it's when we look at those differences that we can sort of leverage this multi-hazard assessment. So what are the areas where things are going well in flood, but less well in bushfires? Why is that? You know, what can we learn from that? What can the flood space learn from what's happening in the bushfire space? If we're measuring similar concepts across different hazards, we can start to pick this apart. You know, what are the areas we can strengthen that are going to have benefits right across the whole system? So that would be around those more generic disaster resilience indicators. And that's just a little bit of what we're doing in the multi-hazard assessment space. I could probably talk all day about that topic. Indeed, many of the other features of the Fire to Flourish program, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of a flavour of some of the things we're doing. So some of the lessons that we've learnt to date in putting this resilience-based or Thrive governance into action. And as I said at the outset, the need for community-led is becoming more and more accepted. People everywhere are realising that this is the only way we can proceed in the face of the challenge that we face. And that's what we've found. We've found that communities are ready, willing and able. Communities really want to be part of this shifting practice. But community-led, and this is so important, doesn't mean community alone. This isn't about pushing agencies out. It's not about leaving communities to fend for themselves. It's about learning to work together with mutual respect. And the way that we do that work is by building trust. We move at the pace of trust. We move at the pace of communities. We build networks and we support communities to build networks. In terms of the role of research, I think this is a really interesting one. As a researcher working in this very applied disaster resilience strengthening space, what we've found is that there is a lot of mistrust towards researchers in communities, very understandably so, because of the way in which researchers have often treated communities in the past, particularly disaster-affected communities, by going in with an extractive mindset, just sort of taking community knowledge and then leaving and not leaving the community with anything. So how do we be community-led in a robust research program. We must and can do things differently, and that's what we're learning to do. And when we do that, when we build that trust and we give back to communities actually really welcome research and researchers with open arms, which is wonderful. And this is helping us ultimately to reimagine the role of universities in serving communities in the disaster space, but in all facets of society. So I just want to leave you with the thought that there is so much potential for cross-fertilizing learning between community resilience in bushfire and flood. As somebody with sort of a foot in both of these camps, I want to see more conversation and more dialogue and more peer learning between these sectors. In some ways, the flood space is further along in the resilience journey, and in other ways, the bushfire space is. Flood resilience and bushfire resilience have many similarities, but we can't forget that there are some differences. So we can't always just take a hazard blind or an all hazards approach. We're talking about complex social ecological systems here. The physical realities matter a lot. Increasing risk and societal changes means that community resilience must be central to the future of disaster risk management everywhere. And finally, that community-centered resilience thinking work that enables thriving is challenging, but it is possible. And thank you for your attention. There we have a website, of course, an annual report from 2003. And please reach out with any conversation. But I do see there are some comments in the chat, so perhaps they are questions that I would be more than happy to explore with you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Adriana and Ewan. A great presentation demonstrating the research and the theory behind community resilience to fire and flood, and then demonstrating the links and the learnings that we can make between the two. There was a couple of things that resonated really quite strongly with me, but the one that stands out the biggest is that statement, community-led is not community alone. I think that's a really important point to take away from this. But you're right, there is some questions there. So what we'll do in the next 10 minutes or so is I'll just read out the questions that people have put in the Q&A and also the chat. Ewan, there was a question there. First of all, thanks for your presentation. My question is about the source data that inspired you to select the specific studies in a specific region. Is it based on policy and planning documents, or is it based on data set and analysis?
Yep, really good question. So I guess, again, didn't have the time in the presentation, but I should clarify my continuum there of flood management approaches and is a high-level heuristic at this point. So this is pre-data collection and analysis. So the way in which I have informed my case study selection is through existing scholarship, but also past and current flood management strategies, and also interviews with key flood practitioners in various parts of the country. So I should make clear that when I am selecting, say, Lismore as typical of a defence approach, or Fisherman's Bend as an integrated approach, it is a high-level heuristic at this stage. And it's not saying that that's where current flood management ambitions are stemming from, rather that the current flood risk and challenge of those places can be understood through that mindset. So Lismore, for example, has a long history of having to put in structural solutions to their flood risk, which then inform the development of increased flood risk challenge that they have there. So one of the key parts of my early stages of data collection will be to road test and validate that continuum and those indicators. Hopefully that answers the question.
I think so. Thanks, Ewan. There's a question for, I think, Adriana, and it's to do with the participatory granting process. Can you give us an idea of the types of projects that was supported through that process, I should say? And was there a framework that helped in deciding which projects to support?
Yeah, sure. So the projects that have been funded, there was 49 projects funded in 2023 across the 4 LGA areas, and they vary a lot, as you can imagine, because we have a broad community-led understanding of what disaster resilience means. Some of them are really big, like implementing a local caring for country rangers program, for example, that includes cultural burning, regeneration, environmental regeneration, all that kind of stuff, through to small local projects like a local evacuation plan, or supporting the renovation of a local hall so that community has a place to gather, and also to evacuate to when a disaster occurs. So there's really a huge amount of variety. In terms of the framework that we've used to support communities to come to these projects, I described a little bit about the resilience planning to granting process, which looks different in each of the places we've run it, but broadly is a community-based visioning process where a group of co-designers come together to work through understanding their experience, their community's experience of disasters, what worked well, what their strengths are, what they'd like to see changed, create a vision for their community, and then identify priority areas for funding. So that's one way that we're doing it. And so we sort of take them through that process based on a lot of research and a lot of experience that's in resilience planning processes that's come before us. And then they go through it and they come up with their priorities. We have also run a number of more light touch open grant rounds where we set a set of criteria and have a local decision-making board, and then local community-based organisations apply to access funding. And again, we're trying to be deliberatively quite different to other grant funding that's available. So whereas other grant funding programs might be rigid and require somebody who's really good at writing grant applications, we really support community-based organisations to get an application in and to make it a good one that's got a good chance of being funded. There's another process that's in train right now in Tenterfield. So there was a bushfire in Tenterfield at the end of October last year. Following that event, a number of community members approached Fire to Flourish and asked us to conduct a post-event review on the community's experience of that fire. So not on the fire suppression, not on the agency operations, but on the community's experience of preparing, responding, recovery. And so we've done that. And from the priorities for change that have come out of that, we're running a grant round where community-based organisations will be able to apply to access participatory grant funding. And again, giving those organisations support to develop up really, really robust applications that are not onerous in terms of, and in a way that is accessible to volunteer-based organisations, for example. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Adriana. I've got a question, and it relates to, we've demonstrated in the presentation that a lot of the principles and processes are applicable to both fire and flood, but I'm wondering, do you see them being applicable to other hazards that we might see as well? Like, I guess drought comes to mind for me, but you did talk about storm being part of the measurement framework as well, and I guess even other hazards that we might want to build resilience to going forward, like pandemics, perhaps?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I think the applicability to other rapid onset hazards is rapid onset place-based hazards is quite clear. So flood, bushfire, storm surge, cyclone, earthquake, those ones that the transferability is quite good. Also heat wave. The CRMC can be used for heat wave, and the Red Cross is using it in Sydney for that purpose in Western Sydney. And a lot of there's some qualitative differences with heat wave, but by and large, the processes that underlie community-led disaster resilience strengthening apply there as well. And I think when you get into the slower onset hazards like drought, I think it needs a little tweaking, but by and large, that's applicable too, because what we're talking about fundamentally is the processes of bringing community together to do this visioning, to understand their system, their complex social ecological system of their community, to make connections with each other, to make connections with all the gamut of government agencies and not-for-profits who are working in this space, and then to work effectively together. And so that, I think, applies regardless of the hazard that you're talking about. And this is where we see some really great stuff happening in some hazards, in some areas, and that other hazards, the sectors that are working on other hazards, can really learn from.
Great. I don't see any more questions in either the chat or the Q&A, so I'm wondering if there's anyone in the audience who might like to just come off mute and ask a question. We've probably got enough time for one, and I'd be interested in particular, anyone in the practitioner space. I know there's some names that I recognise. They're in the flood management, emergency management, fire management space. They're just interested in, is there any questions from practitioners out there or any queries?
Chris, just while we wait for that, Bronwyn has just noted that she's put a couple of questions in the Q&A chat box as well.
Sorry, I missed that one.
So Bronwyn's first one there, Adrian, this might be one for you, is around the non-for-profit sector and how that sector can assist in this space. For example, environment NGOs are already campaigning for nature-based solutions, climate adaptation and resilience for communities and ecosystems. But do you have any further thoughts on advocacy that non-for-profit sector could do?
I can't see Bronwyn's question, unfortunately. Can you read it out to me? Or is that
sure. Yep. How can the not-for-profit sector, such as advocacy organisations, assist in this space? For example, environment NGOs that are already campaigning for nature-based solutions, climate adaptation and resilience for communities and ecosystems.
Well, I think not-for-profits, the not-for-profit sector, like those environmental organisations, are already at the forefront of this space. And so it's about building connections between programs like Fire to Flourish and those organisations at the program level, but in particular at the local level. And so that's what we're doing, because we've got a huge amount to learn from each other, I think. And the more we can work together and come together, because we've got a similar objective in terms of centering community, in terms of supporting environmental regeneration and sustainability, the better. Fire to Flourish has no time for territorialism. We want to work with everyone. And we really love throwing our hat in with lots of different initiatives, both at the local level and at the programmatic level. And sort of because we do have this pot of local locally place-based funding for participatory granting, a lot of the organisations that end up applying for our grants are local environmental organisations and other civil society orgs that are working at the local level, because it's another pot of funding for them to do their work. And the more we can sort of match funds or, you know, build projects together with in-kind contributions, that kind of thing, that the bigger the impact can be, and the more that we can demonstrate together the possibilities that come when we do centre community in strengthening disaster resilience, the better it's going to be for generating that evidence and that guidance at the national level to make this the reality for not just the communities we're working with, but for all communities across Australia.
Thanks for that, Ewan and Adriana. I've now managed all my different windows and it can now see the Q&A questions, but we are running out of time. So what we'll do is we might call the Q&A session closed now, but we can follow up with those questions that are outstanding and we'll do a written response to those. So apologies for missing that one before. Run out of time a little bit. Always good to have lots of questions. So just a bit of a plug for our next webinar in August, the 21st of August. We'll be talking about protecting headwater streams and a participatory approach that we implemented with Melbourne Water and University of Melbourne and Alluvium Consulting supporting, looking at ways of protecting headwater streams from urban development. If you're interested in that one, there's a QR code there that you can register for that webinar. We also have a program of future webinars as well. So you look at this QR code and you'll see future webinars planned out for the balance of this calendar year. We'll start planning into next calendar year shortly. So keep an eye on that and register if you're interested. Lastly, I'd like to thank the presenters, both Ewan and Adriana. Thanks for your time. Very insightful and interesting presentation. There's a support team in the background that helps me to prepare these webinars. So I thank the team in the background for helping with that. And of course, I thank the attendees today. Hope you've found the content interesting and insightful, because I certainly did. So thank you, everyone, and hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.